It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Jessie Norman, Labour MP Ben Bradshaw, Director of the Left of Centre think tank Class, Ellie Mae O'Hagan, and Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Today, Westminster will unite to pay tribute to Sir David Amos, the MP killed in a suspected terrorist attack on Friday. As well as remembering their colleague, MPs are reflecting on the threat posed to the democratic process.
We mustn't allow those who attack our democracy, who want to threaten us, who want to stop us talking to our constituents and serving our communities, we can't allow them to win.
I'm passionate about wanting to change the world, and nobody's going to stop me.
The husband of the murdered MP Jo Cox says this is a moment to reflect on the wider state of British politics.
How do we create a culture in our democracy which means that violence is less acceptable, whether that's violence of language or whether that's violence on the street?
And will the COVID vaccine programme see us through the winter?
This year has been dominated by the vaccine rollout programme. We've got to live with the virus, but ensure that all the protective measures are in place.
Let's start today's programme with the scene live here in Westminster. You can see the flag flying at half-mast over the Victoria Tower in the Houses of Parliament. It reflects the sad and sombre mood at Westminster and throughout the country in the wake of events on Friday, when the Conservative MP, Sir David Amos, was killed in a knife attack while holding a constituency surgery. Normal parliamentary business, most of it will be suspended because people will want to remember, MPs will want to pay tribute to Sir David Amos in special prayers in the House of Commons to start with this afternoon, and a minute's silence before the Prime Minister leads those tributes from across the House. And you can see here already flowers have been laid by colleagues, no doubt, and staff at the Houses of Parliament in memory of Sir David Amos in New Palace Yard. They're just next to Westminster Hall. There'll be a service of remembrance too later on in the grounds of the Palace of Westminster, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Jessie Norman, you may well be contributing to those tributes in the House this afternoon, but first your reflections on the death of a colleague.
It's a most dreadful moment, and it's very hard to know what to say, really. David was absolutely one of the nicest, kindest people you could ever imagine. I remember moving in to, my first day in the House of Commons. You wait for a while, then you get your office, and my office was just down the corridor from his, and he could not have been a more welcoming or generous colleague, helping one to kind of get sorted, to get organised, to get up and running, to take some of the mystique and the panic out of the building. I mean, he was just a delight. And, of course, his office was a veritable emporium of incredible things and animals that he'd picked up over the way. Because
his campaigns.
He was it was just fantastic, yeah.
Obviously, in terms of MPs from across the House, they'll be united, won't they, in wanting to pay tribute. David Amos, a Conservative colleague, but obviously you will probably also want to remember Jo Cox.
Yes, and this has been another grim few days, hasn't it, for our democracy, and the assault is on all of us and on our political system. I mean, I didn't know David as well as others like Jessie, but he was a rare ally on the Conservative benches when I was the Animal Welfare Minister, taking through the Hunting Act and the Animal Welfare Bill, and he'll be very sorely missed. He was a great figure in Parliament and a very popular figure across all the parties, but these things have been happening far too often, and we've got to do something about it.
And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes' time. Ellie, Sir David Amos may not have been a huge political name, but he worked tirelessly, like most MPs, for his constituency in a front-facing role, as many other people do, shop workers or bus drivers coming into daily contact with members of the public.
Yes, and I think, he clearly was a diligent public servant and a very popular member of the House in Parliament. But I also think that we should remember that he was a father and a husband and a friend. And there's a family and a group of friends that have lost someone that's really important to them today. And that's, I think, the main thing that we should be reflecting on is the amount of people who will be grieving today for this man.
I mean, Camilla, some people watching may be wondering about the huge focus that there has been on his death at Westminster and in the media over the last few days. Is that partly also because of the threat it represents to the democratic system?
Well, I think certainly there's a concern, legitimately so, about the increasing toxicity of public discourse and the way that MPs are viewed. What's interesting about Sir David is this sense that we've only found out posthumously exactly what he did in his public role and how far-reaching it was, you know, from 1 minute work on animal rights to the next on endometriosis. And actually, there are a lot of politicians who are doing exactly the same, pretty unsung. There's a degree of cynicism about people in public life, and they encounter a hell of a lot of abuse and criticism. And largely, in my experience, and look, I'm paid to be cynical and to make judgments of people, most MPs are in it for the right reasons, and they're doing the public good, and they want to make a difference. And therefore, I hope that this case actually does change the mindset around people that are elected to serve, because as we're going to discuss, I'm sure later, you know, particularly online, the vitriol and abuse that MPs are facing right now, I think is completely unacceptable.
Before we do talk about that, I just want to show our viewers and our guests here in the studio these headlines in a couple of the papers. The Daily Mail. So why didn't anyone stop him? That is talking about the suspect who is in custody and making reference to the fact that he had been referred to the de-radicalisation programme Prevent. And this in the Daily Telegraph. Security chiefs warn of lockdown terror plots, fears over bedroom radicals converted to extremism during months under virus curbs. Let's talk to the BBC security correspondent, Frank Gardner. Frank, the man in custody is 25-year-old Ali Harbi Ali, arrested under the Terrorism Act. What more can you tell us?
He's a British national. He grew up in Croydon. His parents came here from Somalia in the 1990s. His father was an advisor to Somalia's prime minister. One of the papers has gone down the track that there could possibly be a Somali connection and something to do with Qatar, because Sir David Amos had made a visit to Qatar very recently. Qatar is involved in Somalia, but I think, frankly, my own feeling is that that's a bit of a red herring. But detectives are looking at all possible angles here. One of the first things they looked at was whether there would be any connection, because of the Somali heritage, to the prescribed Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab. No evidence of that, I'm told, has emerged so far. They're keeping an open mind, but it's likely that whatever drove him to these alleged actions was a lone instinct, something that he did by himself, self-radicalization, essentially.
Frank, I mentioned Prevent. It was one of the headlines in the newspapers that he had, this man, been referred to Prevent, but not placed on any security watch list. You have mentioned there this idea of perhaps acting alone, being a lone wolf.
Yeah, well, first of all, on Prevent, Prevent was sort of revised as part of the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act quite recently, and it placed an onus on a number of bodies, particularly in the education sector, to refer those who they suspected were being drawn into radicalization to Prevent. But it doesn't carry any legal burden. They can't force people to do it. It's a voluntary thing. You can join it and leave it at any time, and it doesn't carry a criminal record. And I think this is possibly one of the things that's going to be looked at. But it's, again, controversial, because if you make it mandatory that anybody who refers themselves or allows themselves to be referred to Prevent, if their name is then going to appear on an MI5 database, they're simply going to say, nah, don't want to have anything to do with it. So the idea is to catch those people upstream long before they become actually violent. And we understand that Ali Harbi Ali was referred to that scheme 6 years ago. So, you know, that's a long time ago. MI5 have two lists. They have, well, they've got probably lots of lists, but two ones that we know about that they talk about. One is their active list of SOIs, subjects of interest, which numbers about 3,000 to 4,000 people that they are in one way or another actively watching. And it's a dynamic list. Every day the priority changes. It goes up and down according to what people's actions are. And then there's another list of former SOIs that's over 20,000 long. and people can pass from one list to the other. They have to prioritise this. And the problem I think that they face, where people can sometimes slip through it, is that people of violent intent don't go and signal it usually. I mean, sure, they might leave a digital footprint which can be found afterwards, posthumously as it were, but they don't announce it. So, for example, the convicted, or rather the killer from the fishmongers, the man who murdered several people at Fishmongers Hall, didn't announce it, what he was going to do. He just decided that's what he was going to do. And they can't see into people's minds. That's the trouble. And lockdown has certainly, I mean, they've been talking about this. MI5 and the police have been talking about their concerns ever since March last year, worrying that people were spending too much time online on dangerous sites.
Frank Gardner, thank you very much. Let's talk about security arrangements with our guests, starting with the MPs. Jesse, after the murder of Jo Cox, security for MPs became a focus, quite rightly. Did you change your security arrangements in any way back then?
Yes. I mean, I think everyone was devastated by Jo Cox's death, and certainly I did, and I didn't. I decided with my team, because of course an awful lot of our concern is about our staff rather than just oneself, and we took the view that it would be better not to do as it were, unscripted in-person surgery.
So you had to make appointments?
You have to make appointments. You actually get a better service if you do that, because the appointment process teases out documents you need to read in advance, and therefore you can be much more focused on what the specific concern of the person is. So it does have an advantage. And I think it works if you're very much engaged in your constituency otherwise. If different MPs have different styles, if you're not, then not seeing constituents is quite a big loss.
What about any security changes that you made, Ben?
Well, security upgrades to my office. We were all offered security upgrades to our homes, which we may come on to at some stage, but has been a bit of a shambles with the security company that was appointed to do it and the way that the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority have gone about administering it. Many of my colleagues have got real concerns about that. I've had appointment-only surgeries for many, many years, partly for the reason that Jesse has just described, which actually you can give your constituents a faster, better service. They're very happy. Your problem is dealt with immediately on the phone or by email. Only if people really insist on seeing me, they're then triaged by my staff and never have a member of staff on their own or me on my own. We have security in my office security systems, not a policeman present. I don't want the police to have to spend time looking after me doing mass surgeries. It's not a good use of their time, not a good use of my time, not a good use of my constituents' time.
I mean, you're nodding away. Jesse, what about this suggestion of security guards, all the time?
I think it's very much a matter for individual MPs to decide how they feel about this. I personally would feel it would be a waste of police time in many cases and an impediment. If it could be shown to be beneficial, actually mainly for staff and for reassurance, then that would be a case for it, but I'm quite sceptical. I think MPs sign up to be public figures in their constituencies. They went into it, they knew there was some risk associated. It's a serious matter if those risks have changed, but it doesn't change the fundamental premise of the democracy, which is that we live and work in.
I mean, Ellie, listening to the two MPs, Jesse and Ben, say, I mean, they did make changes for themselves and to protect their staff. Do you think these changes are enough? I mean, do you think they risk being a barrier between MPs and their constituents?
Well, I agree with what Jesse said there. I mean, obviously, the immediate priority has to be the safety of public servants, and also that they feel safe, not just that they are safe, but that they feel safe. That's obviously the most important thing. But I think most of us would like a democracy where our MPs come from our communities, where they're elected by community members, and where they can live side by side with the people who represent them. You know, I used to get the bus with a couple of Labour MPs who lived near me in the morning on the way to work. And really, that's the kind of society that we all want to live in, where MPs can be part of our communities. So, yes, safety is the most important thing, but I think we need to have a longer conversation about how we get to that society and what it will take. And I think most MPs, would agree with that as well. Right.
I mean, Camilla, listening to you, do you think the current security arrangements, and they may differ between MPs and constituencies, I mean, do you think there needs to be more consistency in that, and do you think they are enough?
Well, if you compare the security arrangements for actually going into Parliament, which are obviously very stringent and have been since the murder of PC Keith Palmer, and then you compare that to what happened in David Amos's case, where appointments were made, and we think that the suspect actually did make an appointment and then just could walk in off the street and not be subject to any search or kind of vetting whatsoever, that does seem to be, very contradictory. At the very least, there would be quite legitimate talk, I think Diane Abbott said yesterday, about putting screens up. Nobody wants to see this. But then again, nobody wants to see another MP attacked. And equally, shouldn't bags be searched? Should there be metal detectors at these particular events? I appreciate exactly what Jessie and indeed Ben are saying. Actually, a lot of this work can be carried out on Zoom and by letter and email and indeed on the phone. Of course, we want to maintain access, but in order to preserve democracy, you've also got to protect it.
Right. I mean, you were shaking your head, actually, at the idea of metal detectors and bags being searched, but you're both nodding on Zoom.
I don't think any of us want that. Look, you can stay very accessible to your constituents, living in your constituency, going on the bus, walking around your constituency. We go canvassing every weekend, random knocking on doors. I feel perfectly safe, or pretty safe, doing those things. I'm not announcing my presence in advance. I think it's the announcing of one's presence in advance, which I would urge all colleagues to think really, really carefully about. I certainly have, since the Jo Cox murder, have not announced my presence at things in advance, but it doesn't mean to say I'm less visible to my constituents. They still see me out and about doing things.
Can I ask you about something different, Jessie? Because there's been some anecdotal sort of evidence from MPs saying that there are huge disparities in the level of support offered by different police forces around the country. Andrew Rossendale saying he's had 4 or 5 incidents when I've had to report things to the police, and quite often they literally don't do anything, or the onus is on me to give endless statements which lead nowhere. And Paula Sheriff, MP, when we received a death threat, former MP I should say, for a death threat at my office by telephone, the police came to my office and they laughed. And then when a man was continuing harassing me for a period of months on an incessant basis, the police went out to see him and told him that they sympathised with him. Now, I'm not asking you to comment, obviously, directly on those particular cases, but just generally, do you think perhaps it's not been taken seriously enough? Perhaps it's been normalised, the fact that MPs get death threats?
It's very hard to comment, obviously, on the wider picture. Certainly, I think every MP is aware of threats of physical harm and death. I don't think there's any distinction really between MPs, although of course many female MPs get much worse than many male ones do. In terms of police, certainly in Herefordshire, they've been extremely effective and supportive. It's a small, well-knit, focused force, relatively speaking, so you might expect that. I suppose the other thing is we have all been contacted also by Special Branch, so there's been a national response as well as a local one.
Your experience, the reaction...
My local police have been fantastic, and whenever there's been an issue, a death threat, it's been acted on. They contacted me proactively on Friday, very soon after this appalling event. Been very responsive. I wouldn't want them to have any more burdens placed on them because of my job, and I think there are ways that we can manage this where MPs can do their job, be accessible to their constituents, but not live, in a cage with metal detectors and police outside your surgeries.
Let me read you part of the statement from the family of Sir David Amos. They say, "We ask people to set aside their differences and show kindness and love to all. This is the only way forward. Set aside hatred and work towards togetherness. Whatever one's race, religious or political beliefs, be tolerant and try to understand." Now, Brendan Cox was one of the first to react to the tragedy on Friday. His wife, Jo Cox, was murdered in 2016 while she was working in her constituency. This is what he had to say this morning on the BBC.
I think too many of us are responsible for dehumanising our opponents, the people that we disagree with. We suddenly decide are racist or are evil or are fascist, or we decide that they're stupid. And that dehumanisation that happens on social media, but it also happens in real life, I think that's an area that we can all make a difference in, like actually getting to know people who have different views than you.
And this is a headline, Stephen Pollard article in the Daily Mail. "We must not confuse toxic discourse with this outrage." Camilla, a suspected terror attack, is it appropriate to draw a connection between that and the state of political discourse online and offline?
Possibly not. I know there's some discussion right now about whether the suspect may have been looking at YouTube videos of preachers like Anjem Chowdhury. There's a difference between the internet and social media and the discourse on social media. But what I would say, reflecting what Brendan said there, this kind of strangely non-nuanced black and white approach, literally, if you don't agree with me, then you're evil. It needs to stop. You look at Sir David, and actually he was a bundle of contradictions. On one hand, he believes in pro-life because he was a Catholic, but on the other, he's helping endless women with endometriosis and other gynecological problems. Equally, he was pro-Brexit, but yet, as many have testified in his own community, was hugely helpful to Muslims and other people with immigration claims. You know, actually, people are all quite complicated, and this idea of just divisive, black and white, you think this, you don't agree with me, therefore you're wrong, I think has created an environment where certainly people show a great deal of a lack of respect towards people in public office. They think that they're, you know, it's a free-for-all. I think Jess Phillips said, you know, we aren't treated as if we're human. Well, in what way is that acceptable?
I mean, being kinder to each other is something I hope we can all agree on, Ellie. But is it realistic when it comes to political discourse?
I think we need to be really careful here. Of course, you know, the statement from David Amos's family is not only is it something that we can all agree on, but it's actually incredibly courageous for them to make such a statement when they must be so devastated. So of course we can all agree with that. But I think we need to look at a bigger picture here, and we actually need to say, well, who is involved in this discourse? And what we often find when we really look at what's going on is that you have ethnic minorities who are subject to racism in the press. You have, you know, columnists like Katie Hopkins once called people cockroaches. So often you have people in power who can be really awful about ordinary members of the public and can be discriminating, or government policy that takes people's basic necessities away from them. I think a good example of that is the universal credit cut. And sometimes people get angry about that on social media, and they can be quite rude. But we need to be very careful to distinguish between people being angry about being subject to discrimination or having things taken away from them with actual threats to life, because one is a very important part of holding people to account, and that's democracy. And the other is something really, really serious. And what we don't want to do is throw the baby out with the bathwater and actually curb free speech and curb democracy in order to deal with the threats to life that really are a problem, not just for MPs, but for lots of people working in public service jobs.
Do you accept that distinction, Camilla?
I accept the distinction, but of course, and of course, you know, you can look at economists like Katie Hopkins and think that she has contributed to this issue, and that's probably a fair comment. But and I agree that people must reserve the right to express anger and indeed to hold their elected representatives to account. If mistakes have been made, of course, that's my job as a journalist as well as the general public's. But then, you know, what we're also talking about here is just vile and abusive discourse, particularly online and particularly targeted at female MPs, which makes their day-to-day life a misery, and which also drives people out of working, not only as MPs, but in Parliament per se. You know, there's members of staff that have just left the job because it's been so abhorrent. And that then will result in a lower quality of people coming into to the job, because frankly, who would want to do it? And if we're in a situation where nobody wants to be an MP, then I think that's a really worrying development for democracy.
Ellie?
Well, you know, in some countries around the world, you can be imprisoned for what you say on social media. So to me, it's about finding a balance. It's about making sure that we protect the right of people to have free speech. It's about making sure that our democracy is protected so that people in power are held to account and aren't just allowed to act with impunity. But it's also about saying very clearly that public servants, and indeed anybody working in public jobs or anybody doing any job, in fact, should not feel under threat, should not feel abused and chastised. That, I think, it's about finding a balance, and that's what we need to do.
Jesse?
Well, I do think there are two other things just worth mentioning. One is the distinction between, you know, criticising the policy and criticising, you know, casting all kinds of aspersions on, you know, the individual, claiming that they're vile or horrific or something else. Of course, this, you know, calling a politician a scoundrel is fair comment, has been done for hundreds of years. Nothing wrong with that. The other thing is, but I do think we should think about the difference between the act and the person. Then the other one is labels. I just think, you know, avoiding these labels, which are so much a call of arms to hatred and to vile behaviour, that's the other thing I would encourage everyone to think about.
Ben?
I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction between what Camilla and Ellie May are saying, actually. They're just, I mean, I think most of us know where the boundary lies between robust debate and holding your politicians to account and vile, threatening abuse. I think the social media giants have some responsibility here. Governments have responsibility when it comes to regulation. We all have a responsibility. But I think we can carry on having a robust political discourse that's civilised without having, but we do have to do something about what Camilla describes as this really vile, abusive tone sometimes on social media, and anonymous social media, which is...
We'll come on to the issue of anonymity, but let's just pick up on what you've been saying, because the BBC's disinformation reporter Mariana Spring has been looking at the abuse directed, particularly at women online, for a new panorama on BBC One this evening. She spoke to Ruth Davidson, former leader of the Scottish Conservative Party. Let's have a listen.
The attacks that have come directly to me, a lot of them have been about my politics, some of it has been about my physical appearance, a lot of it has been about the fact that I'm gay, and a lot of it has been about the fact that I'm a woman who has opinions. Before social media existed, somebody could get done for being threatening in the street, for being threatening in real life, for some of the things that they said and the hate speech that they had. The fact that they're talking directly to someone online, the fact that it's through the medium of their phone, doesn't stop that being threatening.
That was Ruth Davidson. You can watch Panorama, Online Abuse, Why Do You Hate Me, tonight on BBC One at 7:30. Let's move on to what can be done, as Ben has said a couple of times during the programme, because the Online Safety Bill is designed to make social media sites act on harmful content, even when it is legal. Otherwise, they could find themselves at risk of fines or criminal action from the regulator Ofcom. Is that enough, Ben?
I don't think so. And I think what's really interesting is what's happening in the States at the moment, where you have a bipartisan approach with regard to Facebook. And I think we're only really getting to grips now as an international community, actually, because this has to be done on an international basis with regulation of these tech giants. I mean, we had a similar issue, not exact parallel with tobacco, didn't we? Where for years and years and years, the tobacco industry denied that there were any harms being done, there were any dangers in their product.
Although some will say that wasn't a fair comparison.
No, but it took too long for governments to regulate the tobacco industry. And I think it's the same with seatbelts in cars. I think we've got the same problem with tech giants, and I think we need to move much more quickly on this. Internationally, I'm pleased what's happening in the States. I was very pleased that Priti Patel said she would look at the anonymity issue. I understand there need to be safeguards for certain people, but I do think the point that's just been made by Ruth Davidson, that in the past, if you behaved in this way, there would be consequences. But you can hide behind anonymity now on Facebook or social media, and I just don't think that's acceptable given what's been happening.
Right, Camilla, we've talked to you before about your experiences and the abuse you've received online. Do you think we need to wait to see the impact of the measures in the Online Safety Bill before calling for further measures to be taken?
The trouble with the Online Safety Bill, though, is that concerns are already being raised at the idea of it being devolved to the social media giants to decide what is or isn't harmful. And there's questions over whether they can be trusted with that, because we know there's loads of harmful content, not least inspiring people to be anorexic, and suicide websites and others that have been deeply harmful to children, and no action's been taken. Also, in the round, Ellie May was talking there earlier about people not being able to publish with impunity. Well, that's exactly what they do online. Journalistically, I can't just go around defaming people or using invective, abusive or offensive, grotesquely offensive language. And yet, by comparison to the newspaper industry or mainstream media, actually the internet's the Wild West. So there's not enough regulation at all. And it's no wonder then that this spills out into public discourse.
Jesse?
Well, it's true. You get a kind of incontinent, splurging aggression that is enabled by anonymity. I think Ben's point about the way in which the argument about the tech giants has evolved in America is very interesting. Part of the problem is we just don't know enough about what's going on inside them. We don't understand anything like, to the extent they do, what the dials and the knobs are telling them about the levels of different kinds of abuse that they may be enabling, and that's part of the problem.
Ellie, what's your response to Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, suggesting she's going to look at the idea of ending anonymity online?
Well, I am one of the much discussed women who get a lot of abuse online. And first of all, I think it's really important to say, so for example, I'm often called an effing idiot and things like that. And I think that's completely fine, because that's just somebody being a bit rude. It's not actually abuse. So I think it's really important to say, That's not abuse. That's just somebody being coarse and rude. And I think we can all live with that. But I've also had people publish my home address and threaten to rape me. And that is much more serious. And I think it's important that we distinguish between two of those things. And on the second one, I used to have a man send me abuse regularly, about 3 or 4 times a day. And when I complained about it to a friend, he said, well, I can just call his wife and tell her. And the reason he said this to me was because this man had linked his Twitter account to a website that contained his home address and his home phone number on it. Because actually, people are quite bold when it comes to abusing people online and threatening people. They often don't need anonymity. The person who killed David Amos, the person who killed Jo Cox, did not have anonymity. And actually what this risks doing is, again, criminalizing ordinary members of the public who are using not their real name because maybe they don't want to get in trouble at work, but they want to be free to express themselves on the internet, for perhaps being a bit rude. And I think that is, and I keep saying it over and over again, but that is not democracy. Putting people into a sort of legal process because they've been a bit rude is not what we should be doing in a democratic society. So again, this is about being really careful and being careful to distinguish between ordinary people being rude towards public figures, which, as Jessie said, is a lifelong tradition in this country, and actual threats of violence, which are really serious and need to be taken seriously.
Camilla?
But it's precisely because the online giants don't take the action that they need to take against the more serious stuff. So I've received death threats and all sorts as well. It's because that doesn't happen that everything just becomes homogenized. I couldn't agree more with Ellie in the sense of preserving freedom of speech and letting people express themselves. You know, equally, if I'm called an effing idiot, I don't really care. If, however, my children's lives are threatened, that's a different matter. And the response to both of those incidents seems to be the same. It is lacking and it is completely inconsistent and frankly doesn't have any teeth. And therefore you get this whole situation where everything, of course, very, very, very serious incidents of abuse should be singled out and punished, and people should be taken off sites like Twitter if that happens. Of course they aren't, and it doesn't happen. And even if they are, they then set up under another anonymous address. So that's why everything is lumped in together.
Just before we move on, Jessie, do you think the online safety bill needs to be looked at again, carefully?
Well, I haven't read it as carefully as I should have done, so it's hard to comment. But I can tell you that it's going to receive a lot of comment over the next few weeks, and I've no doubt, as Pretty has said, it's going to receive a lot further scrutiny than it has done. All
right, let's talk about COVID, because we haven't discussed actually daily cases for a while. Let me just show you the graphics that give you a feel for where we stand at the moment. The first one, COVID-19 daily cases in the UK, standing at just over 45,000. We can also see patients in hospital with COVID on the 14th of October, a few days ago, just over 7,000. And finally, the latest figures on deaths. There were 57 deaths reported yesterday. Often that figure is lower, coming just after the weekend. But those are the daily figures. Let's talk to Jo Coburn, Chief Data Reporter at the Financial Times. Hello to you. John, how do those figures compare with other similar countries?
That's the key question now, or rather, I think there are two key questions. And I think one point we need to make at the outset here is that we're not saying that the UK is on the brink of any kind of terrible winter wave again. It's more that whereas Western Europe, the rest of Western Europe is currently in a very good position regarding COVID, the UK is only in a relatively good position. So deaths, for example, are currently about 3 times as high in the UK as they are in countries like France, Spain, Italy and Germany. Hospital admissions are more like 6 times as high, but deaths are still only about 10% of what they were last winter. So we're not saying we're on the brink of crisis, but things are just markedly worse than they are in countries that, for all in, as far as we can expect, should be seeing the same thing as us. So the question is, what's going on there?
Right, well, what is going on? Why is that?
There seems to be 2 main factors here. So the first is that, according to data from YouGov, there's considerably more indoor mixing, socialising going on in the UK at the moment. And this is as true in places like Scotland and Wales as it is in England. Now, part of that, of course, will be weather and climate driven. It's a bit colder and damper here, so there's more reason for us to be indoors. But it's also because, whereas there are still some light restrictions or different messaging from governments on the continent, that's not really the case here. So I think a lot of us will can be forgiven for thinking that things are back to normal in terms of socialising. So more time spent indoors in crowded settings and large groups means more chance of spreading the virus. The second big factor is that whereas at the start of this year, I think were sort of patting ourselves on the back for how fast the UK's rollout of vaccines was going, that's actually ironically become a bit of a problem for us now, because what it means is that we have this issue of waning immunity. So as several months pass after you've had your second dose, the protection from that vaccine can start to trail off a little bit. And the issue we have is that because the UK was a couple of months ahead of the rest of Western Europe in getting those vaccines out, it means a lot more people in the UK right now are in that situation where 5, 6, 7 months have passed since their second dose and their protection is starting to wane compared to Western Europe. So it's all the more important that we get that booster programme really accelerating here.
What about vaccinations for young teenagers? Has that been more sluggish, let me put it that way? And is that important in terms of comparison with other countries?
Absolutely. So the JCVI were considering all sorts of evidence over here and making the decision of allowing vaccinations for children aged 12 to 15 and 12 to 17 in the UK. And they took a bit longer than countries on the continent to do that. And what that means is the rollout of vaccines to kids here started later and has been progressing more slowly. So whereas in a country like Spain, about 80% of children aged 12 and above have now had at least one dose of the vaccine. In England, that figure is only about 30%. In Scotland, it's a bit higher. But the point is that is much lower. And of course, the timing of that was also critical. It meant that secondary school aged kids in England went back to school, a lot of mixing, a lot of spreading of the virus, whereas their counterparts across the channel had a vaccine by that point. So virus spreading among the kids come home and unwittingly pass that on to older generations who are a lot more vulnerable.
John, thank you very much for joining us. Jessie, listening to all of that, early success of the vaccine programme, should we be worried about the vaccine programme on an ongoing basis going into the winter?
Well, I think we should be alert and attending very closely to what's happening. And John's graphs are incredibly interesting in the way the picture they show. It's by no means a consistent picture, by the way. I mean, the UK as a whole, Scotland's doing worse in some areas than the rest of the UK. Some other areas are doing different. It's a diverse picture that he paints. In terms of rolling out boosters, yes. In terms of pressing the unvaccinated but the potentially vaccinatable, that is to say people who are not in especially vulnerable groups, that's a really important part of the picture. And I think the government needs to continue to think about what further, as it were, tools it's got in the toolbox going towards Christmas.
Right. Do you think there hasn't been quite the same focus then on rolling out boosters, as you say, and perhaps jabs for youngsters?
I don't think that's true. I think there's been a tremendous attention paid to it. I think the question is simply the logistics of doing it, making sure that people have the right, are eligible for it at the right time. I think the difficulty of managing schools that's not straightforward. I think as you get into different groups, it becomes harder to do. And of course, the point that John made was right, which is the JCVI, which has, in the British scientific establishment, world class.
They're the committee that made the decision on the vaccination.
They had concerns, and it's entirely proper that those concerns should have been properly weighed and assessed before we went forward.
So when you talked about perhaps using or utilising the tools in the toolbox, what are you thinking about there? Further restrictions or...?
Well, I don't know, but if it looks like deaths are really starting to creep up because at the moment, John's identified a relatively modest reduction in effectiveness. And, of course, the international picture is different because they were slower to vaccinate. But if that were to get worse faster than we anticipated, or if it were to yield deaths faster than was expected, then, it might be that the government would want to give more guidance about the use of masks, for example. And, of course, it's not just the government, it would be the devolved administrations as well.
Right. Do you agree with that, Ben, when you listen to what John has been saying?
Yes, I'm rather starstruck being on a programme with John because he's been my hero throughout this pandemic.
Oh, well, there you go. We made that happen for you.
In terms of the information that he's put out there and the data, it's been fantastic. But look, we think it was a mistake when when Boris Johnson took all the restrictions off in July, mask wearing on public transport, for example, enclosed spaces, social distancing, home working, all the mitigations that the rest of Europe has kept. And as John says, you're seeing that through in the figures now. On top of that, I think we have taken our eye off the ball.
Would you like those reinstated? Some of those?
I don't understand why we don't mandate mask wearing on public transport. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, what is it too much to ask, really, to ask someone on a crowded bus or tube to wear a mask? But also, why, forcing people to go back to work, or ending any social distancing and ending advice about ventilation. All of these mitigations have been maintained on the continent. Their levels are now a fraction of ours. But I think we've also taken our eye off the ball when it comes to vaccinating young people. We should have done that in the summer holidays. We're now way behind our European neighbours, and on booster jabs we're also behind, and that's even worse because we started earlier, so we need to be ahead on booster jabs, and we're actually behind.
Where are you, Camilla, on this? I mean, is it understandable to some extent that there isn't the focus perhaps now that there has been in the past as people have come out of lockdown?
Well, if you look at the ONS statistics, and I did do this last week because I've been in the middle of this because I've had 3 children all off with COVID. So I've got a 12-year-old, an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old. It's ripping through secondary schools. The prevalence among the year 7 to 11ers, so that's up to GCSE, is 7%. Yet the prevalence in the 35s to 49s is 1.2%, and the prevalence in the over 50s is 0.6%. I.e., yes, it's ripping through secondary schools, but thankfully these children aren't always passing on to their parents. So my husband and I, by some miracle, but let's attribute it to AstraZeneca, have remained uninfected so far. The point, I think, is that either the children are being overrepresented in the stats because they're having to do these lateral flow tests twice a week, and you could question the wisdom of that because not all parents are doing it. So we diligently lateral flowed, and obviously we got results because we've had 3 who have either passed it on to each other or got it at school. But you have to ask yourself, what's the point of doing that if it's not obligatory on all parents? Therefore, you're always going to have asymptomatic children spreading it within schools.
Right. Well, Ellie, I mean, you can respond to that, but I also just want you to respond to this, which I'm showing our viewers and guests in the Times. COVID in Scotland, vaccine passport rules come into effect today amid backlash. Is that something that you would like to have considered in England?
I think that this was an opportunity to look, to go bigger than that and to actually look at the kind of society that we live in and the changes that we might want to make that not only make us safer during the pandemic, but actually benefit society in the long term. So, for example, at class, we did a report on people's working lives, and we found that nearly half of people say that they couldn't afford to self-isolate. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for that is the fact that we have the lowest sick pay in this country of all of OECD countries, which means that countries like Lithuania, Slovenia have more sick pay, have better sick pay than we do. And this was actually an opportunity for us to raise sick pay to an amount that people can live on, so that people could take time off work, they could self-isolate without worrying about whether they were going to pay their bills. In Victoria, in Australia, you get 2 years with nearly full pay if you're off sick. So it is doable, and it's something that we should be thinking about. So yes, vaccine passports, maybe not, that's something that we should discuss. But this is a perfect opportunity for actually for us to look at most people's lives and what we can do to make people safer and better in the long term. All
right, just briefly before we go, Jessie, I want you to respond to this story in the Sunday Telegraph. Dominic Raab, Justice Secretary, I'll overhaul the Human Rights Act to stop Strasbourg dictating to us. The Justice Secretary says he's devising a way to allow the government to introduce legislation to correct, in inverted commas, court judgments. You wrote the book on this pretty well. Jessie, what's your response?
Well, I don't know exactly what Dominic's got in mind. The previous Lord Chancellor had a process of independent review of the Human Rights Act, which is, I think, still underway. It's very important to keep separate the European Court of Justice, which has nothing to do with the Human Rights Act in its formal operation, because the Human Rights Act is a European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court.
But should judgments thought to be wrong...
Sorry, the HRA has nothing to do with the European Union.
Yeah. All right, well, you've literally run us up to the clock there, Jessie Norman. No doubt we'll get you on again about it. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests, and I will be back tomorrow. Please join me then. Bye-bye.